Hang on a second. Still being recorded.
Hello, hello.
But then you should use the. Do you have the wireless? Do you have this one here? Yeah. Why is it frozen? It's like I can't see the. Should I reconnect? So you're. No, let me reconnect.
That's yes. Where is Zara? Zara is not here.
Zara.
No.
There it is. So let's see. Yeah, I got it sort of working here.
Okay. So maybe just go here.
Like?
No.
This one?
Yeah. You just need to disconnect. Leave the computer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we good there?
Yes. Hi.
I did.
That's fine.
Is it on?
No. It's working. Yeah, it's different. So hi again. So we will pursue our morning with Professor Kamran Khan, who is an infectious disease physician with training in public health and preventive medicine. He is the founder of BlueDot, and he is professor of medicine at U of T. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. I just want to make sure the audio is working okay. Is this working all right? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Great. Well, thanks for having me here today. As you just heard in the introduction, my background is in clinical infectious disease. I've been in practice now for about 20 years. I actually started here in Toronto as an academic physician just at the beginning of SARS. So we're actually coming up on that 20-year anniversary. And then founded BlueDot in 2013. So this is about 9.5 or so years old now. What I was going to do in terms of today's presentation, I know the theme for today's discussion is around early warning systems, but I thought what I would do is just share some of the experiences that I've learned in the last 9.5 years at BlueDot, getting from early detection of threats to quickly understanding what are the risks involved, what's the likely evolution and trajectory of these types of threats, and then ultimately, how do we turn them into timely actions? This was actually, for me, in many ways, the motivation for founding, a private company. BlueDot was ultimately, how do we translate this and get this into the hands of both public and private sector organizations in order to get from an actionable insight into some real-world action? So I'm going to kind of share a bit of my experiences in the last 9.5 years, but I thought maybe it would just be worth starting for a moment with this quote from a Spanish philosopher. It's kind of an interesting and perhaps an opportune moment to remind ourselves as we're coming out of perhaps the acute or emergency phase of the pandemic, that time is the enemy. And if we look to our recent past, say in the last 20 years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic beginning, we can see that there have been quite a few important and disruptive infectious disease events. In 1999, I was in New York doing my public health and preventive medicine training and my infectious disease training. West Nile virus showed up in Queens. Permanently established itself and it kind of changed the landscape of that disease permanently. A few years after 9/11, a few months, I think, after 9/11, anthrax was weaponized and sent through the US postal system, a reminder that these types of outbreaks can be triggered not just from naturally occurring events, but accidents or even deliberate acts. Moved back to Toronto. We had that SARS outbreak that was actually in many countries, more than 24 countries around the world, but a 4-month-long outbreak here in the city. And that was, I think, for me, a really eye-opening experience. In some ways, the city was a bit of a microcosm of what we have witnessed with COVID on a much broader scale. And then, of course, there was a pandemic in 2009, which is, again, just 10 years before COVID. Thankfully not as severe as some other pandemics. And then a variety of other important outbreaks that we've seen, from MERS to chikungunya in Latin America, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, things like MERS in South Korea, Zika epidemic, multiple different Ebola outbreaks in Central and East Africa, of course, COVID, and then monkeypox. And I think it's worth just noting that of these events, 7 of them were declared public health emergencies of international concern, and this is over a 13-year time frame. So roughly every 2 years, we're experiencing some kind of global epidemic emergency. So this has been really the motivation behind the work that we are doing at BlueDot, is that we're seeing more of these types of threats. They're increasing in frequency and scale. They're becoming more disruptive. And ultimately, the belief is that we're going to have to use intelligence to be able to move in a faster and smarter and better coordinated manner. So at BlueDot, what we've been doing for the last 9 years is building this platform around epidemic intelligence, and it's based really on 3 pillars. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through these 3 pillars, just talk a little bit about some of the work we're currently doing, where there are certain areas that we're looking to innovate, and then ultimately how we're getting from early detection of a threat to an understanding of what risks are involved, and then ultimately what actions should be taken. So I'm going to start out just with the identifying and characterizing global threats, that particular pillar. And so to start out with, today, certainly there's a lot more work with machine learning and natural language understanding that's happening in public health. We started this work about 5 years ago and started to consume online sources of unstructured text data. We're currently doing this in 89 languages. That machine translation is happening every 15 minutes around the clock. And then we have used machine learning and language models to ultimately train this engine to pick up early signals of known pathogens, but also syndromes, respiratory syndromes, neurologic, and other types of syndromes that could be indicative of an outbreak. So after the process of having the machine, if you will, go and gather a lot of this unstructured text data and process it, we have a process of kind of triaging inside our organization, where we have a team of experts in epidemiology, public health sciences, veterinarians, clinicians as well in medicine. And there are some analyses that we're doing around anomaly detection. So as we sort of look through this process and we have an alert, we ask ourselves, is this particular event occurring in a place that is unusual? It has not been identified there previously. If it has a seasonal pattern, is it occurring at a time of year which may be unexpected? Or are the magnitude of cases that are being reported inconsistent with what we have seen based on historical data? And finally, are the clinical manifestations actually unusual based on what we've seen in the past? Maybe this is a novel mode of transmission, or there's some other characteristics that really show that this is anomalous and it demands our attention. And then finally, that team is also then applying human intuition and insight. So in many instances, we may not know what the pathogen is. We may not have good historical data. So this is where we're applying sort of the principles of biology and virology and other considerations. And this is how we go through this process of taking this unstructured text data in all these different languages, having a machine process this, ultimately then looking for things that are anomalous, and then having human experts review this information. Our approach really is that, our belief is that we should let machines play to their strengths and we can let humans play to theirs. So this was the system that actually, back in late December of 2019, had picked up some articles in Chinese and translated those, went through that process that I just described. And as we saw this, and then as our team, myself as well, on the morning of December 31st, seeing this, we're quite concerned about what we were observing here. Certainly it had some parallels to historical events with SARS-CoV-1 back in 2002 and 2003. And so we sent out this alert to all of our clients and partners just to raise awareness of this particular issue. So we're doing this on an ongoing basis for well over 100 different pathogens, known pathogens and syndromes, and this is happening every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. I did want to highlight some areas where we're continuing to do some R&D as we look forward and want to try and expand some of the capabilities of this event-based surveillance system. So one of the areas is consuming multimodal data sources, not just text data, but also looking at things like audio and radio, video signals, and being able to capture some of those text data, do the translation, and then run it through the same types of ML engines to pick up news that may not be appearing in online text. There's a lot more work as we look at some of the advances in language models with GPT-3 and others of how we can start to automate the extraction and structuring of some of these data on places, on things like what are the public health interventions that may be happening in those locations, even some work that really identifies incremental changes day over day. This is something that our team of experts, it requires a lot of effort to be like, there's 100 different articles that have been written and 99% of the content is the same, but maybe there's little bits and pieces of information that are different between the two. And so here we can have a process of identifying what some of the incremental changes are and automating the extraction of that information. And then lastly, we've been playing around a little bit with the natural language generation side of advances in these models, and looking at, can we actually create structured reports and a synopsis of events that we then have our team of experts review and edit. So some really interesting and exciting areas about, tapping into different data sources and engineering the integration of those data sources, using advances in language models to extract deeper insights and contextual information, and then even generating some of these types of reports. On the other side of things, what we have done is all of our team has been trained in open source intelligence techniques. And what this really, the way I would kind of describe this is it's a bit almost like investigative journalism, where you've got a team, and as they find an event, they're going to look to try and validate sources, corroborate information. In some cases, they're going into social media and other sources and trying to extract other pieces of data and insights that help us have a more holistic view of a particular event. So these are some areas that we're continuing to further development in, so that this system can not just detect a threat, but add more context around the particular event. So the second area I'd like to talk about is, how do we go from identifying a threat to then understanding, is this something that is likely to fizzle out? Is this something that has the potential for dispersion? Where should we be looking to next? What are some of the potential secondary impacts and disruptions that may occur? So I thought I'd start out by just taking a bit of a recap to some events back in December of 2019. So we had at BlueDot for a while, a couple of years in advance, had been working with and just trying to learn a bit more about anonymized or de-identified mobile device location data, just to understand how these data are structured, how could we use them, what are the potential strengths and limitations. And so as the events happened in Hubei province in December of 2019, we actually looked back at some of our empirical data. These are data derived from, their GPS data derived from mobile apps, again, all anonymized and following the privacy laws and regulations. And so we looked at were devices that were in Hubei province, and you can see them there in that circle. And we rewound the clock back to the beginning of December to just try and understand, well, where were those devices actually going to over the next 14 days? Where did they appear? And you'll see some places here like Tokyo, like Seoul, Shanghai, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Bangkok being some places where these devices then subsequently appeared over the next 14 days. Now, in many instances, and also in this case, the sample of data that we have were actually pretty small relative to the population. So we'd also concurrently been developing methods to try and understand ground-based movements of populations in the absence of these types of data. And so here is some work that we published in Spatial and Spatiotemporal Epidemiology on looking at airport catchment areas. So if we happen to have an event or an epidemic, well, what are the on the ground movements that we might anticipate people might be making through ground-based travel, and then how does that intersect with commercial airports where people can board an aircraft and then have that long-range movement in a short period of time. So these models, what we're looking at here, are outputs from a model called the Huff model, which is almost like a type of I'd almost call it a type of gravity model. In essence, the factors that are determining how populations move to airports would be determined based on the distance to the airport. So the further the distance is, the less likely it is that someone may use that particular airport. We're not using Euclidean distance here. We've actually taken into account road networks and structures and how the travel time would be to those various airports. And then the other factor that's considered is the so-called attractiveness of the airport. So if it happens to be a large airport where you can get to your destination much more efficiently, that's going to have a bigger draw than going to a smaller airport where you might need to make multiple connections to get there. On the right-hand side, what we actually did was validated some of this work. This is actually Harrisburg International Airport. And so we took some data from a previous study that actually was conducted at this airport to understand, well, where were people coming from when they traveled to that particular airport, and then did some analysis comparing this with the Huff model outputs. And this is an ongoing area of work. In some areas, this works reasonably well. In other areas, there are more limitations. But we've continued to further this work to try and understand these ground-based movements and how they may intersect with commercial airports. So this is not yet published, but this is looking at the Huff model outputs, which are on the right-hand side, with the use of high-resolution mobile device location data. So this map on the left-hand side is looking at the New York State area. And so you can see some of the commercial airports there, JFK and LaGuardia and Newark and so forth. And this is looking really at where those devices ultimately originated from that made their way into JFK Airport, and then comparing some of that with the outputs from the Huff model. So this is an ongoing area of work of trying to gauge in settings where we may have high quality geolocation data, and in other instances in remote areas we may not have the same quality of data. So looking at a few of these different types of techniques. So I just wanted to share, as we were doing this in advance of COVID, this is what is actually built into our platform currently. And when the events in Hubei province were first identified in late December 2019, that blue pin is the location of the market in Wuhan where the first cases were reported, and those circles are the locations of neighboring commercial airports. They're all associated with probabilities, and so if you see as we're hovering over, there are probabilities of using that particular airport, the travel time to get to that location, as well as other factors such as the magnitude and size of the airport, the outbound volume. So this is sort of happening behind the scenes, and we've built up this this kind of local dispersion capability or modeling capability across the entire globe. And it allows us to get a sense as to how we might want to weight the movements of people to these particular airports, which we're then connecting to commercial air travel data on flights. This is all coming from the private sector, flight schedules, but also anonymized passenger level flight itineraries. So in a normal non-pandemic year, there are about 4.5 billion tickets that are sold. on commercial flights. And so what we're doing is capturing that information, looking at all of the origins, all the flight connections at the final destination. So the yellow lines in this image, and this was generated back on the morning of December 31st, 2019, it's really looking at how the market is actually connected to the rest of the world through short-range movements and then these long-range movements. So the yellow lines are nonstop flights. The blue circles are the final destinations of travelers. The larger the circle, the larger the volume of travelers. So I did just want to point out a couple of things here that I thought were interesting. Certainly there's a lot of connection and travel in East Asia, which is perhaps not surprising. But if we look over in our neck of the woods in North America, you'll see nonstop flights over into San Francisco, which is actually where the first known death from COVID has been reported in Santa Clara County. And you'll also see an arc over into New York, which we know was impacted very early in the pandemic, and probably there was some early seeding that occurred in the midst of flu season. So, so this is a bit of how we're taking an alert, trying to integrate that insight with an understanding of how populations may be moving through ground-based travel, and then how that intersects with these long-range movements, so we can be anticipating where things might be headed to next. So I did just want to also share that while we sent out our alert to all of our clients and partners, we did want to get this out in a much broader forum, and so published this article, which we're pretty proud of in terms of just speed and timeliness, because it's actually the world's first peer-reviewed study on COVID, and it's actually early enough that it's not confirmed to be from a coronavirus at this point. It's pneumonia of unknown etiology in Wuhan. And what we did was, while the official word was that there are a handful of cases, there isn't evidence of person-to-person transmission in the early days, we wanted to identify where are the places that are most connected, because if what we're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg, we might want to start looking in these other locations to see whether or not cases may be appearing there. If they are, it's going to tell us something about the magnitude of the event in Hubei province. And what you'll see here with these red circles are, these are the cities that actually the ones that are 12 on the list of the top 20 that we had that first reported cases of COVID-19 outside of mainland China. We submitted this. I will say this is all done before cases appear, not after. And I did want to highlight a couple of cities up at the top of the list here, Bangkok and Tokyo. And I wanted to highlight that for a couple of reasons. One is that as the first cases started to appear outside of mainland China, the first case actually occurred and was reported in Bangkok on January 13th. And 3 days later, the second case was reported in Tokyo. Now, I think the reason I think this was particularly important was it gave us some inferences and insights about the magnitude of the event at the origin, based on our own assessment of the catchment area around the initial cases, the travel volume, the capacity of travelers to go elsewhere. If there were really only dozens or maybe even 100 cases being reported officially, it would be exceedingly improbable to start to see cases appearing in these locations. And so this is the kind of work that you may have read about from Neil Ferguson and colleagues early on, which was taking some of the observed exported cases and then making some inferences based on travel patterns in catchment areas to really infer that in order to observe these cases, we had to be dealing with thousands, and in perhaps thousands, maybe as close as up to 10,000 cases at the origin in order for this to occur. So I think these are some really important insights. We didn't publish our findings, but immediately as we saw those initial cases appear externally, we knew that this had to be orders of magnitude larger than what was being officially reported. And we applied that same technique, that same modeling technique in other instances. As you may recall, in Iran, there were cases that were associated with travel to Iran. but the official number of cases in Iran that were being reported were considerably lower. This is something we published here in the Annals of Internal Medicine, looking at estimating the magnitude of cases and the outbreak size in Iran. And more recently, we did some similar work with Mpox. As we saw the initial cases, periodically we see these cases appear in the UK. There's a lot of travel from the endemic region in West Africa, but then another case appearing in the United Arab Emirates, certainly another one in the United States in the northeastern area of the US around DC. And so as we observe some of those exported events, we use a similar type of approach again here to estimate the size of the epidemic in the origin, and really came to the conclusion that there had to be significantly more cases in the endemic region relative to what was being officially reported. And lastly, I thought I would just go back a couple of public health emergencies back to Zika, and also just describe an approach that we used here to try and, again, better understand transmission in the at the origin. In the case of Zika, what we had to do here was incorporate climatic data around suitability for local transmission. We knew that there was certainly the probability of far more widespread transmission in Brazil. And what we've incorporated here is observances of Aedes mosquitoes and some models that take into account climatic factors to identify locations that are optimally suitable for local transmission. These are the areas in orange, and these locations here, the points on the map, are now reflecting the neighboring commercial airports. And similarly, we looked at where we might expect to see viremic travelers who've acquired Zika locally in Brazil to get on airplanes, and then ultimately where would they be going to next. So if we look at this across the Americas, what we found here was that there were a large number of travelers whose final destinations were in Florida, and that also this was an area that, while the environmental conditions were not quite the same as Brazil, certainly competent mosquito vector, certainly as we got towards the summer months, that the climatic conditions would be suitable for a toxinous transmission. So a viremic traveler might introduce the virus, infect the mosquito, and then that mosquito would be able to live long enough to then transmit that onto another person. Now, we published this in The Lancet in January of 2016, and as the summer came along, this is what was observed, that there were toxinous cases of Zika being acquired in Miami and then in surrounding areas in Florida as well. And subsequent phylogenetic analysis really corroborated that these were the introductions that likely occurred, mostly from parts of northeastern Brazil, were seeded, and then ultimately were the catalyst for these local chains of transmission in Florida. Looking beyond that, I just thought I would share a map here of how some of the travel pattern data also helped us understand where there were connections that weren't necessarily intuitive. One of them was that there were strong connections between Brazil and Angola. And I hadn't quite realized at the time that they actually both have a history of being former Portuguese colonies, and so there may be some cultural or historical ties. And so there was a significant amount of travel going from Brazil into Luanda. So we use that as an opportunity. You can see the circle there is the volume of travelers coming into Luanda from Brazil, and then apply the same type of suitability model month over month to identify where these two might intersect, where there might be a pressure of importation of Zika virus coinciding with suitability. And what we sort of found was around March or April were optimal, and then as the climate changed, that as we got to around November, December, again, there was another intersection in terms of introduction and then suitable local conditions. I think what was interesting is we didn't see any cases being reported of Zika virus at the time, but you'll notice that in around January of 2017, so that's about 9 months after that, period around March, April, some initial cases of microcephaly were being reported. And then the second window was around November or so, and about 9 months later, there is an increase in the number of cases of microcephaly that are being reported. So this may be an indication of Zika virus transmission that wasn't reported at the time. And then subsequently in 2019, this is, as you can see there, the phylogenetic analysis of the introduction of Zika virus into Angola, again, sort of corroborating how this was aligned with some of the travel data and climatic suitability at specific times of the year. So I'm going to just shift gears a little bit. I realize I'm going from one outbreak to the next, but as we think about introduction of a pathogen, I thought I would maybe just go back to COVID for a moment. Zika has obviously a very different type of transmission, but in COVID, as the virus made landfall and started to propagate locally, this is where another instance where we were able to use some of these anonymized mobile device location data to understand whether or not social distancing efforts were actually effective or not. And here we were working with the governor's office in California. At this point in time, there's no vaccines, there's limited diagnostics, we don't really have any significant medical countermeasures. We're using isolation, quarantine, and so forth. And what these dots here are showing over the span of a 24-hour period is for all the devices, what we did is we looked at where the devices spent the majority of their time, which we refer to as their primary location. Once the devices deviated more than 200 meters away from that location, they would start to appear here, and we would be able to measure what was the total aggregated movement around any device, around a single point location. And that gave us an indicator of how much mobility there was, which we thought might be a proxy for contact rates in the population. But it also was valuable to the public health, local and state public health department, because what it was doing, these blue circles are showing us that week over week, the number of devices is decreasing. So the social distancing measures are working, but you will see some red circles appear at certain times. And in fact, those were showing us that there were increases. And as we look closely, these were things like supermarkets, in some places parks, and in some instances healthcare facilities. So this was valuable intelligence for the local and state public health departments to be able to understand, was this working? What was the response, and where might there be specific locations where they may want to make sure that masking is happening appropriately and where they're minimizing contact between individuals. And these types of data came in handy for a number of other use cases. One of them was in the early days understanding adherence to quarantine. So these are not cell phone tower-based data. These are GPS data, so they can be followed anywhere across the planet. And so one of the initial questions here was, upon arrival, are folks actually following the mandatory quarantine over that 14-day period? And it was quite interesting to see here that early on, in the first couple of days, adherence was actually very low. I don't know whether people were gathering supplies or stocking up on groceries, but then you saw that it sort of peaked and then it just gradually diminished as people got, kind of tired of staying in their homes. So this was a way that we could help inform some decisions about whether these policies were actually being adopted and how those were considered in terms of their expected effectiveness. And lastly, because we had been working with these types of data well in advance of the pandemic, we actually had baselines to understand, well, what's normal behavior in terms of population mobility outside of a pandemic. So in 2019, what you can see here, the months are at the bottom. What this is really just showing is that we tend to be more mobile in the summer months, which is maybe not that surprising. And then gradually, as we get closer and closer to the winter and it gets colder, we tend to be more stationary. We tend to have less movement around a particular fixed point, so probably spending more time at home. And when we compare that with what was being observed in 2020, it was quite interesting to see that this was a very, very different looking pattern. These red dashes are actually some of the recommendations for public health stay-at-home orders. And you'll even see some changes in behavior actually coming in advance of the official recommendations from public health. But it also really showed us as more and more of these came out over time, was the population kind of reaching a saturation point and getting fatigue. And so again, these are valuable insights from a public health perspective. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes maybe shifting gears to talk about the last pillar around empowering timely actions. And as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, this was for me one of the motivations for founding BlueDot was how do we get from an early signal that there may be something important happening to an understanding of what some of the risks are. But the hard part is how do you turn this into an action? And how do you do this in a way where, when you're working with a diverse set of organizations, and at BlueDot, it's been really an amazing learning experience to be engaging with organizations across multiple sectors. So in governments, working with public health agencies, departments of national defense, ultimately their interests are how do we make sure that the forces deployed around the world are not coming into harm's way from an infectious disease risk. National security organizations thinking about biological weapons attacks, and are there other events that might be indicative of a deliberate act? But then also working with large global enterprises, and this started to happen quite a bit during the pandemic as the government perspective is maybe around public health and national security. Global enterprises were thinking about corporate security. How do we anticipate where our supply chains may be disrupted or our operations are impacted, or how do we keep our people wherever they're located healthy? And on the flip side, that's kind of managing risk. On the flip side, companies that are producing personal protective equipment and diagnostics and vaccines and therapeutics, how do they anticipate where the demand for those are coming so that we've got the essential things that we need to counter an outbreak in the right places at the right time? This is where BlueDot is focusing its work today, but ultimately it's our vision, and I say this as a practicing frontline healthcare worker, that we need to really be able to bring this intelligence right to the front lines. A clinician has to be able to know, in the middle of flu season, that I should be thinking about something else, even though it might look like influenza. And how do we bring that global situational awareness to clinicians who happen to be cognitively overloaded with way too many things to do? But an astute clinician could be potentially preventing an outbreak from happening. And this is for their benefit, the patient's benefit, but it's also for our collective benefit. And I think the other area that we ultimately want to get more to is how do we bring this down to, engage more of the public in public health, and especially as we think about travelers. If we happen to have fewer people who are infected when they're traveling, we are less likely to be experiencing outbreaks in different regions of the world. So, as I mentioned, we're focusing a lot of our time and effort up at the top of the pyramid, but ultimately, we're excited about engaging a diverse set of audiences and sectors. Just a couple of key learnings, I would say, during the pandemic, which may be pertinent to this audience, is we quickly learned that folks want us to meet them where they are. And what I mean by that is they want this intelligence integrated into their existing workflows. So we had initially been building software and we had them coming to our application, but they had their own business intelligence applications, and they ultimately wanted data services. They wanted this to be in their dashboard or built into their models, et cetera. And so one of the things we've done here is disaggregate a lot of this and actually just have a far more flexible and adaptable approach. And as we've learned, this actually facilitates implementation of actions when you're embedded into the workflows that are normally happening in your organization. So I'm remembering a client telling us, we have to take sand from your sandbox and bring it into ours. Can you just deliver the sand into our sandbox? It's gonna be a lot easier. So this was an important key learning. And lastly, I think I'll just leave with the audiences we're working with, well beyond public health agencies, there's a certainly, these are not subject matter experts. Some of the concepts we're talking about are, I think a lot of people have probably elevated their knowledge of epidemiology and infectious diseases during COVID, but there's quite a bit of work on translating this into consumable, understandable insights so that ultimately people understand the nature of the problem and can implement a solution. So I'm just going to conclude here just by starting with, and again, recognizing the theme of today's discussions around early warning systems. But I think the work that we've been doing at BlueDot is really trying to look at ways that we can integrate the awareness of what's happening to an assessment of risk and understanding of what's the likely trajectory of this particular event and what may be some reasonable interventions. And then how do we translate that and deliver those insights in a way that makes this easy to consume. This is really, really hard, I will say, but it's essential, especially if we think about wanting to get ahead of these types of threats. And then really, this is a whole of society problem. This is something where we need to be engaging multiple sectors. With all due respect, government alone will not be able to tackle this problem. We need private sector, we need academia, civil society, we need to be mobilizing many different audiences. I think, as I've just highlighted here, it's certainly been a really valuable and exciting experience for my team. We have about 80 folks that, this is all we do all day, every day. And so lots of interesting opportunities for innovation in threat detection and characterization with open source intelligence, nowcasting and forecasting. And I guess I'll just conclude with saying this has been an incredible learning experience as we've been engaging these different sectors from the public and private sectors, and also a diverse set of personas and users that are consuming the intelligence. And we've learned a lot leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, but certainly have learned a lot in the last 3 years, which we're now looking at ways to apply those learnings as we kind of enter this next phase of the pandemic. So I think I will wrap up here, and I've just left my email address if there's anyone who wanted to reach out. We're always looking for ways to collaborate with others who are interested either from a technical aspect or who just kind of share a similar vision and would like to perhaps align forces in confronting this challenge. So thank you very much for having me here today, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. Impressive presentation and impressive work. Do you have any question?
Hello, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Very interesting. I had a couple of questions. Let me just see what I wrote down here. Do you incorporate like routine surveillance and monitoring as well as to kind of look at epidemic progression in your platform?
Do you mean like in terms of notifiable diseases from?
Notifiable, yeah, notifiable diseases, or just to even get a baseline.
Yes, so we do, and that's in fact actually why often it's to try and look at the baseline, but of course recognizing that there are certainly gaps and so forth and underreporting, but we do collect that. Most of those data tend to be structured, so that's a little bit easier from an engineering perspective. I just spent time in today's discussion kind of talking about the unstructured text data and how we can create structure out of it, but we do use that for notifiable diseases where we can start to establish the baseline, and then that comes into the so-called anomaly detection, which is if we're detecting something, is it in a geographic area that it's known to be in before? Is it an unusual time of year, or are the case counts inconsistent with what has been observed in the past? So that gives us a little bit of it's part of the triage process of like, we better pay attention to this because it's not consistent with historical trends.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And one other question, I mean, I have more, but I will just leave it to one more. Do you, in terms of the anticipate dispersion and disruption, do you kind of also look at preparedness? So like healthcare capacity, human resources, that sort of thing within a region, and help to inform that kind of risk?
Yeah. So there's something called the Infectious Disease Vulnerability Index, and there are others like this. That one was initially developed by the RAND Corporation. They published that, oh gosh, I can't remember. I want to say it's like 10, 15 years ago. That's something that we've done some adaptations to. And that was done one time at a national level, and we've started to incorporate variables at a subnational level and to look at this in a more dynamic way, because some of the variables may change, on an annual basis, and others maybe are more dynamic. But we do look at this in terms of, detection, dispersion, suitability for transmission, resiliency, and vulnerability to disruption. And so that there's about 40 different indicators that go into that: economic, social, transportation connection, health system capacity, resilience around in terms of things like hospital beds and so forth. So there are a number of those economic indicators, and not social and economic and health indicators. So we do incorporate that. I didn't present that in today's presentation, but it gives us a sense of like how vulnerable an area might be to the introduction, and then if there's further propagation, what kind of impact could that have? So it's almost kind of an assessment of like resiliency. So we do incorporate that. I will say it's still, pretty, it's a fairly high level overview. And then again, every single pathogen will be weighted differently. So what I mean by that is, if we're talking about introduction of cholera, things like sanitation and clean water become really important. But in these types of indices, a lot of these are aggregated and kind of rolled into one value. So this is another ongoing area of work about thinking about disaggregating this and creating indices for different types of pathogens. But lots to do. It's an ongoing area of interest and work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation, Kamran. I was wondering, at the beginning of your talk, when you were discussing your assessment of what could happen from Wuhan, the paper you submitted on January 8th or something, I did not see in the top of your list of countries, Iran and Italy, that were the second wave of like dramatic infections. And I wonder if this is related to what, and I'm blanking on your name, of what Tanya was asking, in terms of suitability, because you had your human mobility estimates, or those estimates were only produced with human mobility based on airports. But I wonder if you have any insights or thoughts about that. I mean, I know that in your list, they probably were highly at the top, but I didn't see them listed at the very, very top.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're seeing in that paper is a snapshot very early. It's kind of that initial wave front versus some of the secondary ones. So as obviously this is one of those things that it's dynamic as you start to have other areas that now become also an origin and a source for further travel, for further infections. This starts to have a ripple effect. So in the initial snapshot of how was Wuhan as one single location connected to other areas, it actually aligned quite well, 12 of those 20 cities, and some of them we are pretty confident were seeded early but didn't report cases from secondary sources of information. Bali, I think, was a good example where we were pretty sure it was introduced very early. But we're really just looking at that initial very, very early wave. But because some of the data that we have, especially if we're looking at things like mobile device data, it is ongoing. Our travel data is really looking at this through historical data, unfortunately. There are ways to look at flights and tickets that have been purchased prior to travel, but the information systems don't capture, there's like huge gaps in those data. So what we're looking at is what are the historical patterns after someone has traveled. And so we have these in monthly snapshots between any combination of cities in the world. So I think to your point, though, is that there's kind of that initial seeding, and then there's secondary propagation, and then there's further seeding. So places like Iran and Italy and so forth were identified in some of those secondary analyses, but not in the very initial wave.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I just have one quick question about the data you've been using, like the mobile data you've been using. I'm just curious about how this data has been connected. Is through like it's just the sampling of the mobile data which connected to specified carrier, for example, Bell or a Cogeco or whatever, or you got those data from like on-site, some of like Blue, whatever, like Wi-Fi sensors, or how? Just curious on that.
Sure. So first of all, just to be totally clear, BlueDot is not in the business of collecting these types of data, or we're not kind of married to mobile device location data. But what we do is we work with external third parties that actually have their businesses oriented around geolocation data. So if you ever look at, you might type in, I want directions to go to Loblaws or the grocery store, and it might tell you, at 5 o'clock, it's going to be really busy. Well, there are companies that are using GPS data that are collected through mobile apps. So like one example would be if you have a weather app, it's certainly, if it's going to work for you, it has to have some location services enabled. And so these companies gather and analyze these data in ways that are de-identified and anonymous. And so we ultimately then purchase some of the data that they have that is looking at all these various devices. And then we can start to look at movements either to or from locations or congregations in particular locations. It's different than cell tower data, which tends to, one, it stops at a border generally, unless the company is across multiple countries, which is usually not the case. Second is in remote areas where you're having to triangulate location based on cell towers. So if you've got a remote area, you might actually have a lot of uncertainties, very little precision. You might be kilometers off in terms of locations, whereas GPS data tends to be pretty high resolution. So that's how we tend to work with external organizations that have done all of the underlying privacy work and security work. And then we work with them to analyze some of these data for specific public health purposes. And really, I will say we're doing this type of work during the emergency setting. It's not something we're doing now going forward on an ongoing basis. Prior to the pandemic, we really wanted to understand the data. I mean, I think we all can probably agree here, you've really got to understand your data and its limitations and so forth before you start arriving at conclusions. So we spent about 2 years just studying and understanding the strengths and limitations and challenges of the data, how we could use it, where it might not be suitable, and so forth. But hopefully that answers your question on where this is coming from.
Thank you very much. This is Ali Asker from York University. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I have a question, but I'm not sure the answer how far that goes, but
Sure.
I ask it anyways. And that's based on your experience working on this very important, interesting field from, I can say, private sector to some extent. And how is your experience in working with or partnering with public sector decision-making, convincing them about or basically the challenges that you are facing in working with public sector, how receptive they are, what are the main issues there based on your experience? I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a slightly provocative question, but I think it's a really important one because I think I would say it depends. And if I think about public health, I mean, private sector organizations in this particular area, this has not been, this is normally under the responsibility of the public sector. I will say that the organizations that we work with ask themselves, what I've often heard is we need more public health actors in the system, and they don't necessarily have to be in the public sector. And then there are certain things that the public sector can do well, which is around making policy decisions and so forth. but things like disruptive innovation and like moving fast and breaking things and rebuilding them and so forth, that may not be the ideal environment to do that kind of work. And so I would say the kind of organizations that have a very progressive view of how we can have more public health actors in the ecosystem, as long as we bring our values with us, as long as we understand what our goals and our objectives are, and if they're aligned, we tend to be working with some of those organizations, not just in Canada, but around the world. In other instances, there is a bit of a feeling that, wait a second, like this is our domain and this is your domain. And so we can often find that it's challenging to initiate those public-private sector partnerships. And so, I think I'd say it's sort of a mixed answer. Some organizations are resistant to it, other organizations are receptive. I'd say the ones that are also receptive do recognize that they have a finite amount of capacity. There's a lot of staff turnover and so forth. And having some of these additional capabilities really, and we're not just technical, we have the subject matter knowledge and expertise and the technical capability. So we often are kind of seen as a bit of an extension of the team and a bit of a skunk works opportunities to kind of do innovative work, but also to be agile and really pragmatic about coming up with solutions. So appreciate the question. Yeah, it's a good one.
Thank you very much, Kamran. Very great presentation. Experiences from Zika, Ebola, and recently COVID has shown that other sectors like the animal sector, the environment, and you talked about the climate. We have seen advances in early warning systems and development of resources to support threat detection, characterization, as well as strengthening preparedness activities. I just want to know what your experience has been in working with these other sectors to integrate these very rich sources of information they have to support the work in public health. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gosh, I'm not even sure where to begin. It's a big question about like the experience working with other organizations. I guess I would say that we started out very much oriented around public health, and then we started to realize that there were other use cases around protecting the armed forces around the world, so national defense, around the security community when it comes to, we might worry about an outbreak of plague spreading somewhere. They may worry about someone breaking into a lab and stealing specimens of plague and taking it to their garage and, creating a weapon. So these other interesting use cases came about. We do have some work with the food and agriculture branches of government as well around things like African swine fever, things that could have impacts on food security and the agriculture industry, but not necessarily present a direct risk to human health. On the private sector side of things, it has been a very, very eye-opening experience and a lot of learning in the last couple of years from, managing risk to an enterprise. It's not public health's responsibility to make sure the supply chains and the operations of a multinational organization are all functioning. So really supporting enterprise risk. But then, as I mentioned early in the presentation, there's also segments that are really, they're producing the medical countermeasures that we need to respond to an outbreak. And so interest in demand forecasting and so forth. But when we think about the ultimate goals here, our goals are aligned. We want to manage risk. We want to make sure we have arrows in the quiver when we need them in the right places at the right time. So these are aligned with the broader goals that we have of creating a healthier and a safer and a more resilient world. But there may be different avenues to go through. And finally, I guess what I will say is when I think about, there are hundreds of governments in the world, but there are thousands and tens of thousands of businesses. And if they can all be public health actors and they can be empowered, that's the way we think about how do we extend our impact by working with other organizations who can then be, making decisions to protect lives and livelihoods. So that's, I don't know, a simple answer. We could probably have a longer conversation afterwards about that experience. But it has been a really eye-opening experience for me about how mobilizing and empowering different sectors is contributing to this broader problem. And whereas I think perhaps a few years ago I had a much more traditional way of thinking about it, and that this is ultimately about policy decisions. So it's been quite a learning experience for me.
Thank you so much. Jean Hong, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Kamran, for very inspiring talk. I'm wondering how you define the spatial temporary resolution of your data analytics. So, for example, we have hundreds of countries, thousands of states, and thousands of mega cities. How do you, without knowing I mean, for Zika, you had success because we knew Zika exists, but for pandemic flu, for COVID pandemic, you made early warning, but how did you identify the source? I mean, the data, the text mining amount. How are you focused on Mexico? Is the whole country Mexico State or Mexico City, for example? So how you define the resolution in the beginning?
Yeah, thanks, John Hong. And I think you know, when it comes to detection, we're often relying on what the original source has. So in our system, there's you know, all the appropriate links so that one can go back to the original source of the information. And in some cases, we may hear about something at a very high spatial resolution. It might be a particular hospital. In other instances, we may hear about something that's happening at a city level, or even at a state or provincial level. So it really depends on the ultimate source. And then, you know, in some ways, this can constrain the kinds of analyses that we can do. If it's too far aggregated, and it's aggregated at a very high spatial or temporal unit, it can present certain limitations. So, but I think the simple answer is that we are going through the original data. We may find, you know, is this at a hospital level or at a city level? And then our team is also trying to corroborate this. This is sort of the open source intelligence techniques that I talked about, where they're kind of operating almost like investigative journalists, going out there into social media and other sources and trying to further refine and characterize what's happening at the event. But it is largely dependent upon the source of the unofficial information that we're getting.
Thank you, Kamran.
Thank you so much. We will move to, let's thanks again our speaker.
Thank you.